Everyone dismissed him as just another desperate single father trying to give his daughter something he couldn't afford. Gavril Droswin worked double shifts at the community center, mopping pool decks and fixing broken lockers, barely scraping together enough for his young daughter's swimming lessons. When he timidly approached the registration table for the elite youth diving program, Olympic coach Celiora Vrenak barely looked up from her clipboard. "This program requires serious commitment talent," she said coldly, her voice dripping with the kind of dismissal reserved for dreamers who didn't belong. But when 8-year-old Lysen took her first dive during tryouts, the entire aquatic center fell silent. What no one knew was that this quiet, overlooked man had once been destined for Olympic glory himself. And the coach watching in stunned disbelief? She was the teammate whose betrayal had cost him everything 20 years ago. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Gavril Droswin didn't belong in the gleaming corridors of the Brookhaven Aquatic Center. At least, that's what the whispers suggested as he pushed his maintenance cart past the trophy cases filled with Olympic medals and championship banners. The morning sun streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, casting dancing reflections from the pool's surface onto the pristine white walls. It was a temple to aquatic excellence, and he was just the man who kept it clean. His weathered hands gripped the mop handle as he worked, methodically through the facility's administrative wing. 20 years of manual labor had left their mark on his once athletic frame, but his shoulders still carried the breadth of someone who had once cut through water like a blade. Now at 42, he wore the Navy uniform of Brookhaven's facility staff, his name embroidered simply, Gavril Maintenance. The irony wasn't lost on him. Every morning, he walked past photographs of swimmers he'd once trained alongside, their faces frozen in moments of triumph he would never experience. Their eyes seemed to follow him as he worked, a constant reminder of the life he'd lost, the dreams that had drowned in deeper waters than any pool could contain. "Dad, you're going to be late for the parent meeting," came a voice from behind him. Lysen Droswin, 8 years old and brimming with the kind of fearless energy that made lifeguards nervous, bounded down the hallway. Her sandy hair was still damp from the recreational swim session, and she wore a faded purple swimsuit beneath her terry cloth cover-up. The fabric was thin from countless washes, but her smile could have powered the entire facility. "I'm not late, sweetheart," Gavril said, checking his watch. "Still got 15 minutes, but I want to get there early so I can watch the big pool," she said, tugging at his hand. "Coach Morrell says they're going to announce tryouts for the elite diving program today." Gavril's stomach tightened. They'd discussed this before, the impossibility of it, the financial reality that kept dreams at arm's length. The elite program cost more than his monthly salary, and that was before equipment, travel, and all the other expenses that came with serious athletic pursuit. "Lysen, we talked about this," he said gently, kneeling to her level. "That program is for families who can afford." "I know," she interrupted, but her eyes held that stubborn spark he recognized from her mother. "But what if there are scholarships? What if they need volunteers? What if we just watch today and see what it's all about?" He said, unable to deny her hope entirely. The Brookhaven Aquatic Center's main pool area was a cathedral of competitive swimming. 8 lanes stretched 50 meters, each marked with floating lane ropes and alternating blue and white. The diving well occupied the far end, its platforms rising like steps to the gods at 1, 3, 5, 7, and 10 meters. Electronic timing systems flanked the competition pool, their displays dark but ready to capture split-second victories and defeats. Gavril and Lysen found seats in the bleachers alongside other parents and their young athletes. The crowd was distinctly different from the recreational swimming families Gavril knew. These parents wore designer athletic wear and discussed training schedules with the casual authority of people accustomed to excellence. Their offspring moved with the fluid confidence of swimmers who had never known anything but success. At exactly 7 p.m., Seliora Vrenak emerged from the coach's office. She commanded attention without trying. At 39, she possessed the kind of presence that filled spaces larger than her 5'6" frame should have allowed. Her platinum blonde hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and her piercing blue eyes surveyed the gathered families with the calculating gaze of someone who measured potential in fractions of seconds. She wore a navy blazer over the official Brookhaven coaching polo, and her stride spoke of someone who had never learned to doubt herself. "Welcome to the Brookhaven Elite Diving Program. Information session," she began, her voice carrying easily across the natatorium. "My name is Seliora Vrenak, and I'll be direct because that's how this program works. We don't coddle. We don't make excuses. We create champions." Gavril found himself studying her face, something familiar tugging at his memory. 20 years was a long time, and people changed. But something about the set of her jaw, the way she held her shoulders, sparked recognition he couldn't quite place. "This program is not recreational," Seliora continued. "We train 6 days a week, 50 weeks a year. We compete at national levels. We produce Olympic hopefuls, not weekend warriors. The financial commitment is substantial, the time commitment is absolute, and the performance standards are non-negotiable." A mother in the front row raised her hand. "What about financial assistance?" Seliora's expression didn't change. "We offer 2 partial scholarships per year for exceptional talent coupled with demonstrated financial need. However, scholarship recipients are held to even higher standards than paying athletes. We expect return on our investment." Gavril felt Lisanne's hand slip into his, her small fingers warm and trusting. He knew he should leave, should spare them both the disappointment of wanting something so far beyond their reach. But something kept him anchored to that bleacher seat, watching as Seliora outlined a world that might as well have existed on Mars. "Tryouts will be held this Saturday," Seliora announced. "All candidates must demonstrate basic diving competency, including front and back approaches, as well as fundamental platform work. We'll also evaluate physical conditioning, coachability, and what I call water sense, the intuitive understanding of how your body moves through aquatic space." The session concluded with paperwork distribution and individual conversations between parents and assistant coaches. Gavril watched families exchange contact information, their young divers already forming the social bonds that came with shared elite aspirations. "Dad," Lisanne whispered, "can we at least ask about the tryouts?" Before he could respond, he found himself walking toward the registration table, Lisanne's hand firmly gripping his own. The closer they got to Seliora, the stronger that nagging sense of recognition became. Something about the way she moved her hands when she spoke, the slight tilt of her head when she listened, stirred memories he'd spent 2 decades trying to bury. "Excuse me," he said. When they reached the front of the line, Seliora looked up from her clipboard, her blue eyes meeting his for the first time. For just a moment, something flickered across her expression, a microsecond of uncertainty that was gone before he could be sure he'd seen it. "Yes?" she said, her tone professionally neutral. "My daughter would like information about the tryouts," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. Seliora's gaze dropped to Lisanne, who stood straighter under the inspection. "How long have you been diving, young lady?" "I haven't really," Lisanne admitted. "But I swim every day after school, and I can do backflips off the low board. And I'm not scared of the high platforms." Not being scared and having technique are very different things, Seliora said, though not unkindly. "This program requires significant financial commitment. Are you prepared for that level of investment?" The question hung in the air like chlorine vapor. Gavril felt the familiar heat of shame creeping up his neck, the same sensation that had followed him through 20 years of explaining why he couldn't afford what others took for granted. "We're exploring our options," he said carefully. "Seliora, studied him more intently now, her eyes narrowing slightly. "And you are?" "Gavril Droswin," he said. "I work here in facilities maintenance." Something shifted in her expression, so subtle he might have imagined it. "Droswin," she repeated, as if testing the weight of the name. "Have we met before?" The question sent ice through his veins. "I don't think so," he said quickly. "I've only been working here for 3 years." But even as he spoke, he could see her mind working, processing, searching through memories that might be better left undisturbed. 20 years of deliberately ordinary living had made him forget how sharp Celia of Renak had always been, how she never forgot a face or missed a detail that mattered. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Well," she said finally, handing him a tryout registration form, "if your daughter is serious about this sport, Saturday will tell us what we need to know." Tryouts begin at 8 a.m. sharp. As they walked away, Lysen practically vibrated with excitement. "Dad, did you see how she looked at you?" "I think she likes you." Gavril forced a smile, but his hands trembled slightly as he folded the registration form. Celia of Renak didn't like him. She was trying to remember where she knew him from, and when she did, Saturday's tryouts would become the least of his problems. Because 20 years ago, Gavril Droswin and Celia of Renak had been more than teammates. They'd been training partners, best friends, and ultimately, the architect and victim of the biggest scandal in U.S. diving. History. And now his daughter wanted to dive. Saturday morning arrived, with the kind of crisp autumn air that made the heated indoor pool feel like a sanctuary. Gavril stood outside the Brookhaven Aquatic Center at 7:30, registration form folded and refolded in his jacket pocket, watching through the glass doors as young divers and their families gathered in the lobby. Lysen bounced on her toes beside him, her enthusiasm undimmed by the 3 size too large swimsuit they'd borrowed from the community center's Lost and Found. The straps had been safety pinned to fit, and the faded fabric told stories of countless other young swimmers who had outgrown their dreams or their gear. "Dad, we're going to be late," she said, tugging at his hand. "We're not late," he replied, checking his watch for the dozenth time. "We're just making sure we're ready." The truth was, he wasn't ready. He'd spent the past 3 nights lying awake, staring at the ceiling of their studio apartment, wondering if he was making a terrible mistake. Every rational voice in his head screamed that this was precisely the kind of exposure he'd spent 20 years avoiding. But every time he looked at Lysen's face, saw the hopeful light in her eyes that reminded him so much of her mother, he found himself taking another step toward a precipice he'd sworn never to approach again. "Good morning, Mr. Droswin." The voice belonged to Unira Voltron, one of Celia's assistant coaches. She was young, probably mid-20s, with the kind of eager energy that came from recent competition retirement and new coaching enthusiasm. "Coach Unira." Gavril nodded, grateful for a friendly face. "Lysen, are you excited for your tryout?" Unira asked, crouching to the young girl's level. "Super excited," Lysen replied. "I've been practicing my dives all week in the shallow end." Unira smiled, then looked up at Gavril. "I have to ask, have you done much diving yourself?" Lysen has some natural instincts that usually come from early exposure or genetic predisposition. The question hit like a physical blow. "I've been around pools my whole life," Gavril said carefully. "But today is about Lysen, not me." Inside the natatorium, the diving well had been transformed into an evaluation arena. Timing mats floated in the water to cushion entries, and video cameras on tripods captured every angle. 23 young athletes, ranging in age from 8 to 14, stretched along the pool deck while their parents claimed prime. Viewing spots in the bleachers, Celia stood at the edge of the diving well, clipboard in hand, watching as her assistant coaches led the candidates through warm-up routines. She wore black athletic shorts and a fitted coaching polo that revealed the lean musculature, of someone who had never stopped training. Her platinum hair was braided back in a practical style, and her blue eyes missed nothing as they tracked each young diver's movement. "Welcome to Brookhaven Elite Tryouts," she announced once everyone had gathered. "Today's evaluation consists of 4 components. First, we'll assess your current diving ability with basic approaches and entries. Second, physical conditioning, including flexibility, strength, and water comfort. Third, we'll observe your ability to receive and implement coaching feedback. Finally, we're looking for that indefinable quality we call air awareness, your body's natural understanding of spatial orientation." She gestured toward the 1-meter springboard. "We'll begin with simple front approaches. Show me your best straight dive, and remember, we're not looking for perfection today. We're looking for potential." The first few candidates demonstrated the expected range of recreational diving ability. Some managed clean entries with minimal splash, others belly flopped with impressive dedication, and a few showed glimpses of genuine talent. That made Celiora's assistant coaches exchange meaningful glances. Lee, 7th in line, Gavril, found himself gripping the bleacher seat as she climbed the ladder to the 1-meter board. From his elevated position, he could see her small frame silhouetted against the skylight windows, and for a moment, time collapsed. He was 16 again, standing on a platform in Colorado Springs, feeling the weight of Olympic dreams and the eyes of national team selectors. "Don't overthink it, sweetheart," he whispered, knowing she couldn't hear him. Lysen walked to the end of the board with the kind of fearless confidence that comes from not yet understanding failure. She bounced once, testing the spring, then positioned herself with surprising precision. Her approach was unorthodox but instinctive. She took 3 steps instead of the traditional 4, but her timing was natural, her takeoff clean. What happened next silenced the entire natatorium. Lysen launched herself into a front dive that should have been impossible for someone with no formal training. Her body extended in a perfect straight line, arms reaching toward the water with textbook positioning. She maintained form through the entire flight, entering the water with barely a splash, what divers called a rip entry, where the diver disappears beneath the surface with surgical precision. The pool deck fell silent, except for the gentle lapping of water against the timing mats. Celiora's clipboard slipped from her hands, clattering against the concrete. Her eyes were wide, fixed on the spot where Lysen had vanished before emerging 20 feet away, swimming toward the ladder with casual strokes. "Holy shit," whispered one of the assistant coaches, then immediately covered his mouth, glancing around apologetically. Gavril felt the blood drain from his face. This was exactly what he'd feared, what he'd spent 8 years trying to prevent. Lysen hadn't just shown potential. She demonstrated the kind of natural ability that attracted attention, questions, investigations into family history and genetic predisposition. Celiora's gaze swept the bleachers until it found his. Their eyes locked across the natatorium, and in that moment, he saw recognition dawn in her expression. Not just the nagging familiarity from the parent meeting, but full, devastating understanding of exactly who he was and what his daughter's dive meant. "Again," Celiora called out, her voice slightly hoarse. "Lysen, I'd like to see that dive again. Should I try something different?" Lysen asked, treading water near the ladder. "No," Celiora said, her eyes never leaving Gavril's face. "Show me that exact same dive." The second attempt was even better. Lysen's takeoff was more controlled, her entry cleaner, her natural talent undeniable and impossible to explain without genetic inheritance from someone who understood diving at an elite level. The remaining tryouts continued, but the energy had shifted. Other parents whispered among themselves, pointing between Lysen and Gavril. The assistant coaches huddled around Celiora, their voices too low to carry but their gestures animated with excitement and confusion. After the final candidate completed their evaluation, Celiora dismissed the group with promises of phone calls within 48 hours. But as families began to disperse, she approached Gavril directly. "Mr. Droswin," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "Could I speak with you privately?" Lysen looked between them, sensing adult undercurrents she couldn't quite interpret. "Did I do something wrong?" "You were magnificent," Celiora said, and for the first time, her smile reached her eyes. "Why don't you go get changed while I talk to your father about next steps?" Once Lysen had disappeared into the locker room, Celiora turned her full attention to Gavril. 20 years, she said quietly. 20 years. And you show up here with a daughter who dives like she inherited her technique instead of learning it. "I don't know what you're talking about," Gavril said. But the words felt hollow even to him. "Gavril Thorsel," she said, using his former surname. "Junior national champion. Olympic team alternate. The diver everyone said would revolutionize the sport, until he vanished. After the trial scandal, the name hit him like a physical blow. No one had called him Thorsel in 2 decades. He'd legally changed it after the hearing, after the media circus, after his entire world collapsed in testimony and accusations and dreams turned to ash. That person doesn't exist anymore, he said. Apparently he does, Celiora replied, glancing toward the locker room where Lysen was changing. Because his daughter just demonstrated technique that takes most kids 3 years to develop. Gavril's hands trembled as he reached for his jacket. "We should go, should you?" Celiora asked. "Because that little girl has a gift, Gavril. The kind of gift that comes along maybe once in a generation. And you're going to walk away from it because you're afraid of what people might remember? You don't understand what you're asking. You don't understand what you're asking." "I understand exactly what I'm asking," she said, stepping closer. "I'm asking you to stop hiding from what happened and start thinking about what could happen. I'm asking you to let your daughter become what you never got the chance to be." The locker room door opened, and Lysen emerged, her hair still damp but her eyes bright with hope. "So what happens next?" Gavril looked at his daughter, then at Celiora, then at the diving well where dreams were born and sometimes destroyed. 20 years of careful anonymity balanced against 8 years of watching Lysen's natural love for water, her fearless approach to physical challenges, her mother's stubborn determination wrapped in small girl packaging. "What happens next?" Celiora said, never taking her eyes off Gavril, "is that we find out just how far talent and training can take us when they work together, and despite every instinct screaming at him to run." Gavril found himself nodding. Training began the following Monday with the kind of intensity that separated recreational athletes from those who dreamed of podiums. Lysen threw herself into the program with the fearless enthusiasm of someone too young to understand the weight of expectations. But for Gavril, every session was a careful balance between pride and terror as he watched his daughter's natural ability unfold under Celiora's expert guidance. He negotiated a partial work-study arrangement with the aquatic center, reduced facility maintenance hours in exchange for covering Lysen's training costs. It meant longer days and less sleep, but it also meant he could observe training sessions without appearing to hover. Most days, he cleaned the upper-level offices while keeping one eye on the pool deck below. 3 weeks into training, everything changed. It was a Tuesday afternoon, and Lysen was working on 3-meter platform dives with a small group of advanced students. Celiora stood at poolside, calling out technical corrections with the kind of precision that had made her famous in coaching circles. The session was routine until Keller Vinrith, a 12-year-old prodigy who'd been training elite for 4 years, attempted a reverse 2.5 somersault. The dive went wrong from takeoff. His rotation was too fast, his entry angle too steep. What should have been a controlled descent became a dangerous over-rotation. That sent him crashing into the water at an angle that made everyone on deck wince. He didn't surface. Celiora was already moving before the splash pattern settled, but the diving well was 15 feet deep, and Keller was sinking fast. They're unconscious or disoriented from the impact. The pool's safety protocols required lifeguards to be present during training, but the nearest guard was at the far end of the competition pool, too distant to help in time. Without thinking, without calculating the cost of exposure, Gavril dropped his mop and vaulted over the second floor railing. What happened next defied both physics and rational explanation. Gavril's body moved through the air with the kind of precision that only comes from muscle memory, burned deep by thousands of repetitions. His 15-foot drop transformed into a perfect reverse pike dive, his body rotating with mathematical precision as he plunged toward the water. He entered cleanly, barely disturbing the surface, and disappeared into the depths. The entire training group stood frozen, staring at the spot where their maintenance worker had just performed a dive that belonged in Olympic competition highlight reels. Underwater, Gavril reached Keller in 4 powerful strokes, wrapped an arm around the young diver's chest, and propelled them both toward the surface. They broke through together, Keller coughing up pool water but conscious and alert. But it was what happened after the rescue that truly shattered the carefully constructed walls around Gavril's past. As he treaded water, supporting Keller while Ciliora and the arriving lifeguards took charge of the medical response, one of the younger divers pointed at him with wide eyes. "Coach Ciliora," the girl whispered, her voice carrying clearly in the sudden silence. "He dives just like the guy in the video you showed us. The one from the old Olympics." Ciliora's face went pale as she realized what the student meant. 3 weeks earlier, she'd shown the training group footage of legendary divees from Olympic history, including highlights from the trials where Gavril had competed under his former name. The resemblance in style, technique, and natural ability was unmistakable once seen side by side. "That's impossible," said another student. "That guy was famous. He wouldn't be working as a janitor." But Lysen, who had been silent through the rescue and its aftermath, looked from her father to her coach with the kind of understanding that comes from having 2 people she loved suddenly make terrible sense. "Dad," she said quietly, "is that why you always knew how to fix my dives before I even started formal training?" The question hung in the chlorinated air like an accusation and a revelation combined. Every eye on the pool deck was fixed on Gavril as he helped Keller to the ladder. His rescue technique, as flawless as his spontaneous dive, had been impossible to explain away. Ciliora moved first, stepping toward the pool edge as Gavril climbed out. Water streamed from his maintenance uniform, but his posture had changed. The careful slouch he'd cultivated for 20 years was gone, replaced by the natural carriage of an athlete who had once commanded international attention. "I think," she said carefully, aware that every word would be dissected and remembered, "we need to have a conversation. All of us." She dismissed the other students early, but several parents had arrived for pickup and witnessed enough to ensure that rumors would spread regardless of official silence. Gavril sat in a plastic chair beside the diving well, a towel draped around his shoulders, while Lysen perched on the pool deck next to him. "When I was your age," he said to his daughter, his voice barely above a whisper, "I thought diving was the most important thing in the world. I trained 6 hours a day, gave up everything else, dreamed of nothing but Olympic gold." "What happened?" Lysen asked, though part of her already knew the answer would explain why her father flinched whenever Olympic coverage appeared on television, why he'd never taught her to dive despite clearly understanding the sport better than most coaches. Gavril looked at Ciliora, who stood a few feet away, her own expression carefully neutral. "I made a mistake. A big one. And it cost me everything I'd worked for." "Not everything," Ciliora said quietly. "Your talent didn't disappear, Gavril. It just went into hiding. For good reason," he replied. "Maybe 20 years ago," she said. "But your daughter just watched you perform a dive that most elite athletes couldn't execute under pressure. She's going to have questions." Lysen was indeed full of questions, but the one she asked surprised them both. "Dad, Are you ashamed of me learning to dive? The question hit Gavril like a physical blow. What? No, sweetheart. Never. Then why do you look so sad every time I get better at it? He had no answer that made sense. No way to explain that her success felt like watching his past and future collide in ways that might destroy them both. So instead, he pulled her close and held on tight, feeling the weight of 20 years of secrets pressing down like water at the bottom of a very deep pool. I'm not sad about your diving, he said finally. I'm scared about what comes next. Celia knelt beside them, her voice gentle but firm. What comes next is that we figure this out together. All of us, around them. The natatorium had fallen quiet except for the gentle hum of circulation, systems and the distant sound of the recreational pool. But Gavril could feel the walls of his carefully constructed anonymous life crumbling like a dam under pressure. Because tomorrow word would spread. Parents would start making connections. Someone would search online for old competition footage and find the face that matched the name that matched the scandal that had once dominated sports. Headlines. And Lysen, who had never known her father as anything other than a loving parent who worked hard to provide for her, would learn that some gifts come with prices that echo across decades. The revelation was no longer whether Gavril Droswin had once been someone else. The revelation was whether that someone else could emerge from 20 years of hiding without destroying everything good they'd built in the shadows. Word spread through the Brookhaven diving community like ripples from a perfect entry, subtle at first, then impossible to ignore. By Wednesday morning, Gavril noticed the whispered conversations that stopped when he entered a room, the way parents' eyes followed him during pickup times, the sudden interest in his work schedule from facility staff who had barely acknowledged his existence for 3 years. The tipping point came Thursday afternoon when Dr. Avenya Tharwick, Brookhaven's sports medicine director, approached him as he was replacing pool chemicals in the storage room. Gavril, she said, her tone carrying the careful neutrality of someone who'd been elected to ask difficult questions. I had an interesting conversation yesterday with my colleague at the Olympic Training Center. We were discussing that remarkable rescue dive you performed, and he mentioned that your technique looked familiar. Gavril didn't stop measuring chlorine tablets, but his hands moved more slowly. I've been around pools for a long time. Yes, but not many pool maintenance workers can execute a 15-foot reverse pike with Olympic-level precision, Dr. Tharwick said. My colleague pulled some old footage from the 2004 Olympic trials. Imagine my surprise when I recognized not just the diving style, but the diver. The measuring cup slipped from Gavril's fingers, scattering chlorine tablets across the concrete floor. I don't know what you think you know, but I know that Gavril Thorsel won 3 national junior championships and was considered the most promising American diver of his generation, Dr. Tharwick said quietly. I also know that he disappeared after allegations of performance-enhancing drug use were investigated by USA Diving. Though charges were never proven, the storage room felt smaller suddenly, the chemical smell more overwhelming. That was a long time ago. Not long enough that your muscle memory forgot how to save a drowning young athlete, she replied. The question is, what do we do with this information? Before Gavril could respond, Celia appeared in the doorway. Her expression was unreadable, but tension radiated from her posture like heat from concrete in summer. Dr. Tharwick, she said carefully, I believe this conversation should include me, since it affects my program. The 3 adults formed an awkward triangle in the storage room, 20 years of secrets and assumptions hanging between them like morning fog over water. Finally, Dr. Tharwick broke the silence. The board is asking questions, she said. When parents start researching online and finding newspaper articles about scandals and missing athletes, they want answers. Especially when those athletes are now working in our facility and their daughters are training in our elite program. What kind of questions? Celia asked, though her tone suggested she already knew. The kind that involves background checks, verification of credentials, and discussions about whether someone with a controversial competitive history should have access to young athletes. Dr. Tharwick replied. Gavril felt the walls closing in with familiar suffocating pressure. I never lied about my background. I just didn't volunteer information that wasn't relevant to my job. Wasn't relevant? Dr. Tharwick raised an eyebrow. You're one of the most naturally gifted divers in American history, working maintenance at an aquatic center where your daughter trains. That seems quite relevant. He's also someone who's spent 20 years proving he's more than the worst moment of his athletic career, Ciliora said, surprising them both with her defensive tone. Someone who clearly understands diving technique well enough to have helped develop one of the most promising young talents I've seen. Double quotes. Dr. Tharwick studied Ciliora's expression with the calculating gaze of someone trained to read between lines. You knew, didn't you? Before the rescue, before the parents started asking questions. You knew who he was. Ciliora's silence was answer enough. How long? Dr. Tharwick pressed. I suspected during the parent information session, Ciliora admitted. I was certain after Lisanne's tryout dive. No one develops that kind of natural technique without genetic inheritance from elite level ability. And you didn't think to inform the administration? I thought, Ciliora said carefully, that a man who had spent 20 years building a quiet life deserved the chance to decide when and how his past became public knowledge. Dr. Tharwick shook her head. That decision has been taken out of his hands. 3 parents have already contacted the board demanding background investigations. 2 more are threatening to withdraw their young people from the program if we don't provide assurances about staff vetting procedures. Gavril sank onto a stack of pool chemical containers, the weight of inevitability settling over him like water closing over a swimmer's head. What do you need from me? Transparency, Dr. Tharwick said. The board wants a full account of your competitive history, the circumstances surrounding your departure from elite diving, and your qualifications for involvement in youth athletics. I'm not involved in youth athletics, Gavril protested. I clean pools and fix equipment. Your daughter is the fastest improving diver in our program, and half the coaching staff has observed you providing technical guidance during practice sessions. Dr. Tharwick replied. Whether you acknowledge it or not, you're involved. Ciliora stepped forward. What if we formalized that involvement? Both Gavril and Dr. Tharwick stared at her. What if instead of treating Gavril's background as a liability, we acknowledged it as an asset? Ciliora continued. He could assist with coaching duties, provide specialized technical expertise, and offer the kind of high-level competitive insight that most programs would pay thousands to access. Absolutely not, Gavril said immediately. Why not? Ciliora challenged. Because you're afraid of what people might remember? Because you'd rather hide your gifts than use them to help young athletes achieve their dreams? Because the last time I tried to be part of this world, it destroyed everything I cared about, Gavril replied, his voice raw with old pain. Dr. Tharwick looked between them, processing the undercurrents she couldn't quite interpret. There's more to this story, isn't there? Something beyond competitive allegations and career disappointments. Ciliora and Gavril exchanged a glance loaded with 20 years of unspoken history. In that moment, Dr. Tharwick realized she was witnessing something more complex than a former athlete's fall from grace. Whatever the full story is, she said finally, it needs to come out now. Because tomorrow morning, I have to present recommendations to the board about how to handle this situation. I can advocate for transparency and integration, or I can recommend termination and program restrictions. But I can't advocate for continued secrecy. After Dr. Tharwick left, Ciliora and Gavril stood alone in the storage room, surrounded by the mundane tools of pool maintenance and the ghost of dreams that had never quite died. You can't run from this anymore, Ciliora said softly. I'm not running, Gavril replied. I'm protecting my daughter from the same circus that destroyed my life. What if the circus isn't the real threat? She asked. What if the real threat is denying her the chance to be as extraordinary as she's capable of becoming? Through the window, they could see the diving well where Lisen was finishing her afternoon training session. She moved through her dives with increasing confidence, her natural ability refined by expert coaching into something that approached artistry. She deserves better than being the daughter of a scandal, Gavril said. She deserves better than being the daughter of a coward, Celiora replied, then immediately regretted the harshness of her words. But as they watched Lisen execute a perfect front 2.5 somersault, both realized that tomorrow's board meeting would determine not just Gavril's future at Brookhaven, but whether his daughter's exceptional talent would be allowed to flourish or become another casualty of choices made 20 years before she was born. The file was thick, manila-colored, and marked with the official seal of USA Diving's disciplinary committee. Dr. Tharwick had obtained it through official channels, though she suspected Celiora had provided unofficial guidance about which documents to request. Now, 24 hours before the board meeting that would determine Gavril's fate, the three of them sat in Celiora's office as the truth of 2004 spread across the conference table like evidence at a trial. I need to understand what really happened, Dr. Tharwick said, her fingers tracing the edge of a photograph that showed two young athletes standing together on a metal podium. Because what's in the official records doesn't match what I'm seeing now. The photograph was from the 2003 National Championships. Gavril Thorsel and Celiora Vrenak, both 18, both representing different clubs but training together as part of the national team preparation program. Their arms were around each other's shoulders, gold medals gleaming against their Team USA warm-up suits, smiles that spoke of shared dreams and unlimited futures. We were training partners, Celiora said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of memory. Best friends. We pushed each other to levels neither of us could have reached alone. More than training partners, Gavril corrected, his eyes fixed on the photograph. We were going to change diving together. New techniques, higher difficulty ratings, performances that would redefine what was possible. Dr. Tharwick flipped through pages of competition results, coaching evaluations, and media coverage from that era. The picture that emerged was of two prodigies whose complementary skills had created a synergy that dominated national competitions and promised Olympic glory. What changed? She asked. Celiora reached for another document, this one bearing the letterhead of the U.S. Olympic Committee's anti-doping agency. Someone reported Gavril for performance enhancement violations 3 weeks before Olympic trials. Anonymous tip, Gavril added bitterly. Detailed enough to trigger a full investigation. Vague enough that the source could never be identified. Dr. Tharwick scanned the investigative summary. Says here that the accusations were ultimately unsubstantiated. No evidence of prohibited substances, no positive tests, no proof of wrongdoing. But the investigation took 6 weeks, Gavril said. 6 weeks of interviews, searches, media speculation, and suspension from training. By the time I was cleared, trials were over and team selection was complete. Celiora made the Olympic team, Dr. Tharwick observed, looking at another document. Finished 4th in Athens, highest American placement in women's platform diving. I would have finished higher with him there, Celiora said simply. We'd planned our Olympic experience together. Trained our hardest dives in tandem, supported each other through the pressure. I went to Athens alone and dove like someone missing her other half, Dr. Tharwick set down the papers and looked directly at Gavril. Why didn't you appeal? Fight to clear your name publicly? Come back for the next Olympic cycle? Gavril was quiet for so long that Dr. Tharwick wondered if he would answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Because I knew who reported me. The silence that followed was deafening. Celiora's face went white. And Dr. Tharwick felt the temperature in the room drop as if someone had opened a window to winter. "That's impossible," Celiora said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Is it?" Gavril asked, turning to face her directly for the first time since they'd begun reviewing the files. Who else knew about the new supplements my coach was researching? Who else had access to my training schedule, detailed enough to make the accusations seem credible? Who else stood to benefit from my absence at trials? "You think Celiora couldn't finish the sentence. "I thought my best friend, my training partner, my closest confidant in the sport, had betrayed me for a chance at individual glory," Gavril said. "So I walked away from everything rather than spend years wondering if I could ever trust anyone in this world again." Dr. Tharwick watched as 20 years of misunderstanding crystallized between them like ice forming on still water. "But you never actually confirmed this theory?" "I never wanted confirmation," Gavril admitted. The possibility was devastating enough. Celiora stood abruptly, pacing to the window that overlooked the diving well where Lysen was practicing with the evening training group. "You disappeared," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "No goodbye, no explanation, no return phone calls. I lost my training partner, my best friend, and my chance at Olympic success. And I never knew why." "You lost your chance at Olympic success?" Gavril's voice rose. "You made the team. You competed in Athens. You built a coaching career from your athletic reputation. I built a coaching career, trying to fill the hole you left." Celiora shot back. "Every athlete I've trained, every technique I've taught, every competition I've attended has been an attempt to recreate what we had together." Dr. Tharwick cleared her throat. "Perhaps we should focus on the facts rather than the emotions?" Both coaches turned to look at her, and she realized that the emotions were the facts. 20 years of hurt, misunderstanding, and parallel lives built on the ruins of a partnership that had defined them both. "I need to ask you both a direct question," Dr. Tharwick said carefully. "Celiora, did you report Gavril to the anti-doping authorities?" "No," Celiora said immediately, then paused. "But I did something worse." Gavril went very still, 3 days before someone called in the anonymous tip. Celiora continued. "I had a conversation with my coach about Gavril's supplement research. I mentioned that he was working with some company I'd never heard of, trying new recovery protocols that seemed too good to be true. I was worried about him, about whether he was making safe choices." "You told your coach?" Gavril said slowly. "I told my coach, who told the national team medical staff, who told the Olympic Committee Oversight Board," Celiora said, tears beginning to form. "I never intended for it to become an investigation. I was trying to protect you. And your coach never told you that your concern had triggered the report?" "He said he'd handled it quietly, that there was nothing to worry about," Celiora said. "I didn't know about the investigation until you'd already been suspended. By then, I was training for trials myself, and my coach said asking questions would only make things worse for both of us." Dr. Tharwick felt like she was watching a 20-year-old wound finally receive proper medical attention. "So neither of you betrayed the other intentionally, but both of you believed you'd been betrayed." "I spent 2 decades thinking you'd sacrificed our friendship for Olympic gold," Gavril said. "I spent 2 decades thinking you'd abandoned me because I wasn't good enough to keep you fighting for your dreams," Celiora replied. Through the window, they could see Lysen executing a perfect reverse 2.5 somersault, her natural ability enhanced by expert coaching into something approaching professional caliber. She was 8 years old and already diving at a level that suggested unlimited potential. "Where does this leave us now?" Dr. Tharwick asked. Celiora wiped her eyes and returned to the conference table. "It leaves us with a choice. We can let the past continue to define us, or we can use what we've learned to build something better." "Better how?" Gavril asked. "By coaching together," Celiora said. "By giving young athletes like Lysen the kind of partnership support that we never got to complete ourselves." Dr. Tharwick looked at the files spread across the table, then at the two former athletes who had just dismantled 20 years of assumptions in 30 minutes. The board is going to want answers tomorrow. But I think I'm beginning to understand what those answers should be. Outside, the evening training session was ending, and Lysen was toweling off beside the diving well. She looked up at the office window and waved, her smile bright with the kind of joy that comes from doing something you love of people who understand your passion. She's remarkable, Dr. Tharwick observed. She's her father's daughter, Celiora said, and her coach's student, Gavril replied, and for the first time in 20 years, the words carried no pain. Tomorrow's board meeting would determine whether the past could be transformed into foundation, instead of barrier. But tonight, watching his daughter pack her equipment with the careful precision he'd taught her, Gavril allowed himself to imagine what might be possible when talent, training, and trust finally aligned. That evening, Gavril sat at the small kitchen table in their studio apartment, watching Lysen work on homework while the weight of tomorrow's board meeting pressed down like water at the bottom of a deep pool. The apartment was modest but warm, filled with Lysen's swimming ribbons, school art projects, and the careful organization that comes from making every dollar count. Their life together was simple, predictable, safe. Gavril worked his maintenance shifts, Lysen attended school and training, and they spent evenings talking about her dives, her friends, her dreams of maybe someday competing at high levels. It was everything he'd built to replace what he'd lost, and now it felt as fragile as ice on spring water. "Dad, you're making your worried face again," Lysen said, looking up from her math worksheet. "The one where you scrunch your forehead and forget to blink." Gavril attempted a smile. "Just thinking about work stuff, sweetheart. Is this about the rescue dive?" she asked with the directness that 8-year-olds possessed before learning to dance around difficult topics. Everyone at training is talking about how you moved like a professional diver. The questions he'd been dreading had started immediately after the rescue. Lysen was too intelligent to miss the whispered conversations, the way other parents looked at him differently, the sudden interest in his background from people who had barely noticed him before. "What would you say if I told you that before you were born, diving was my whole life?" he asked carefully. Lysen set down her pencil and gave him her full attention. "I'd say that explains why you always know exactly what's wrong with my technique, before Coach Celiora tells me. And what if I told you that sometimes when people are really good at something, other people expect things from them that aren't always fair or healthy?" She considered this with the seriousness she applied to mathematical word problems. Like how everyone always asks Sarah to sing at school events because she has a good voice, even when she just wants to be regular sometimes. "Exactly like that," Gavril said, marveling at her ability to grasp complex concepts through simple analogies. "Except instead of school events, it would be competitions and training and traveling and interviews, and people always watching to see if you're good enough. That sounds exhausting," Lysen said. It was. She studied his face for a long moment, then asked the question he'd been hoping she wouldn't think to ask. "Is that why you never taught me to dive before I started with Coach Celiora? Because you didn't want me to have to deal with all that stuff?" Gavril felt something crack inside his chest. "I wanted you to love swimming and diving because you chose to, not because it was something I needed you to be good at. But I am good at it," she said matter-of-factly. "Really good. Coach Celiora says I have natural instincts that usually take years to develop." "You're extraordinary," he agreed. "That's what scares me." Lysen climbed out of her chair and settled beside him, her small hand finding his larger one. "Dad, do you think I'm too young to understand grown-up problems? Sometimes I think you understand them better than most adults. Then can you tell me what's really happening? Because the not knowing feels worse than whatever the truth is, Gavril looked around their small apartment, at the life they'd built together from nothing, at the security he'd created through 20 years of deliberate invisibility. Then he looked at his daughter, who possessed not just his genetic gift for diving, but her mother's fearless approach to confronting difficult realities. Tomorrow, there's a meeting at Brookhaven where some important people are going to decide whether I should keep working there, he said. They found out that before you were born, I was a competitive diver. A really good one. But something happened that made me leave that world, and now they're worried about whether it's safe for me to be around young athletes. What happened? She asked. Someone accused me of cheating, and even though it wasn't true, the investigation ruined my chances of competing in the Olympics. I was so hurt and angry that I walked away from diving completely. Lisen absorbed this information with the same focused attention she applied to learning new dive techniques. Were you friends with Coach Celiora back then? The question surprised him. What makes you ask that? The way you two look at each other sometimes. Like you're having conversations with your eyes that the rest of us can't hear. We were training partners, Gavril said. Best friends. We were going to compete in the Olympics together. What happened to your friendship? I thought she was the one who reported me for cheating. She thought I abandoned her because I didn't care about our partnership. We were both wrong, but it took us 20 years to figure that out. Lisen nodded slowly, processing the complexity of adult relationships and misunderstandings. Are you friends again now? I think we're trying to be. Good, she said with the decisive tone she used when solving problems. Because you're both better coaches when you work together. I can tell. How can you tell? When you both watch me dive, I feel like I'm being seen completely. Like every part of my technique matters to someone who really understands what I'm trying to do. Gavril felt tears threatening. This was exactly what he'd feared, that Lisen would become so invested in diving, so connected to the community and the coaching, that losing it would devastate her the way it had devastated him. What if the board decides I can't work at Brookhaven anymore? He asked. What if that means you can't train there either? Lisen was quiet for a long moment, her young mind working through possibilities and consequences. Would that be because of something you did wrong, or because of something that happened to you? Something that happened to me. Then we'll figure out another way, she said with the matter-of-fact confidence of someone who had never learned to doubt that problems had solutions. Maybe we could train somewhere else. Maybe Coach Celiora would help us find another program. Maybe you could start your own coaching business. It's not that simple, sweetheart. Why not? Gavril struggled to explain the complexity of reputation, the way scandal could follow someone across decades, the reason he'd chosen invisibility over risk. Because when people know you as someone who had problems, they sometimes decide you'll always be someone who has problems. But you're not, Lisen said firmly. You're someone who takes care of me and works really hard and knows how to fix everything that breaks and makes the best pancakes in the world. If people can't see that, they're not paying attention. Her faith in him was both heartbreaking and terrifying. She had no concept of how cruel public judgment could be, how media attention could transform private pain into public entertainment, how quickly a story about second chances could become a story about scandal and questionable decisions. What if the attention makes things difficult for you at school? He asked. What if other parents decide their daughters shouldn't train with you because of my history? Then I'll know which people are actually my friends and which ones are just being nice because they think they're supposed to be, Lisen said. Mom used to say that hard times show you who really cares about you. The mention of her mother sent familiar pain through Gavril's chest. Alina had died when Lisen was 3, too young for Lisen to remember much beyond fragments and photographs. But somehow, Elena's wisdom had found its way into their daughter's worldview anyway. Your mother would be proud of how brave you are, he said. She'd be proud of how brave you are too, Lisen replied. Hiding isn't brave, Dad, but protecting people you love is. What if I can't protect you from what comes next? Lisen considered this question with the gravity it deserved. Then you'll teach me how to protect myself. That's what good coaches do, right? They help people get strong enough to handle whatever happens. As they sat together in their small kitchen, Gavril realized that the stakes of tomorrow's board meeting weren't just about his job or even Lisanne's training opportunities. They were about whether he could finally trust that the life they'd built together was strong enough to withstand the truth about his past. Because regardless of what the board decided, the secret was out. By Monday morning, other diving programs would know his history. Parents would search online and find old newspaper articles. Coaches would remember stories they'd heard and connections they'd never made. The choice was no longer between hiding and exposure. The choice was between running again and standing firm, between teaching his daughter that shame was permanent and showing her that courage could transform even the most painful chapters into something useful. "Dad," Lisanne said as they prepared for bed, "tomorrow at the meeting, are you going to tell them the truth about everything?" "I think I have to." "Good," she said, hugging him tightly. "Because the truth is that you're the best father in the world, and anyone who gets to work with you is really lucky." As he tucked her into bed, Gavril realized that somewhere in the process of protecting Lisanne from his past, she had become strong enough to help him face his future. Tomorrow's board meeting would determine many things, but tonight, he was certain of at least one truth. Whatever happened, they would face it together. The Brookhaven Aquatic Center's conference room had never felt smaller. Gavril sat at one end of the polished table, flanked by Celiora and Dr. Tharwick, facing a panel of board members whose expressions ranged from curious to concerned to openly hostile. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, he could see the diving well where Lisanne and her training group were working through their morning session, their young voices echoing off the water-board chair. Malden Creastown, a silver-haired man whose pharmaceutical fortune had funded half of Brookhaven's facility upgrades, tapped his pen against a thick manila folder labeled Personnel Investigation, Gavril Droswin. The sound was rhythmic, deliberate, designed to emphasize the gravity of the proceedings. "Mr. Droswin," Creastown began, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to difficult conversations, "we appreciate your willingness to participate in this review. As you know, recent events have raised questions about your background and its relevance to your position at this facility." "I understand," Gavril replied, his hands steady despite the familiar anxiety that board rooms and official proceedings always triggered. "Let's begin with the facts," said board member Rovira Thalrose, opening her own copy of the investigation file. Gavril Thorsel, born 1982, three-time national junior diving champion, Olympic team alternate in 2004, investigated for performance enhancement violations prior to Olympic trials, cleared of all charges, but withdrew from competitive diving immediately following the investigation. "Is this accurate?" "Yes. And you legally changed your name to Gavril Droswin in 2005, moved to 3 different states over the following decade, and have worked exclusively in facility maintenance roles since leaving competitive athletics?" "Yes," Creastown leaned forward. "Help us understand why someone with your athletic credentials and coaching potential would choose to hide that background while working at a premier aquatic facility." The question Gavril had been dreading hung in the air like chlorine vapor. Around the table, 6 board members waited for an explanation that would make sense of 20 years of deliberate invisibility. The investigation in 2004 wasn't just about performance enhancement allegations, Gavril said carefully. It became a media circus. Reporters contacted my family, my former coaches, anyone who had ever trained with me. They dug through medical records, financial statements, personal relationships, looking for any detail that might support the accusations. "But you were cleared," noted board member Therick Corvan, a former Olympic swimmer whose own competitive career had ended more traditionally. "Being cleared and being forgiven are different things," Gavril replied. Even after the investigation concluded, people remembered the accusations more than the conclusions. Coaching positions became unavailable. Training facilities found reasons to deny access. The diving community is small, and reputations follow you. Celiora spoke for the first time since the proceedings began. If I may add context, board members, the 2004 investigation occurred during a period of heightened scrutiny around performance enhancement in Olympic sports. The accusations against Gavril were particularly damaging because they suggested systematic cheating rather than isolated poor judgment. You're defending him, observed Thalrose with interest. I'm providing perspective as someone who witnessed the aftermath firsthand, Celiora replied evenly. Christown shuffled through documents. According to our research, Mr. Droswin, you and Coach Vinak were training partners during the period in question. Were you aware of this connection when she was hired to lead our diving program? No, Gavril said. Celiora's maiden name was different, and she'd been coaching internationally before returning to the U.S. I didn't recognize her immediately. When did you recognize her? During the parent information session for the elite program. And you didn't disclose this connection? Gavril felt sweat beading on his forehead, despite the conference room's aggressive air conditioning. I hope to avoid exactly this kind of situation. Which situation? Asked Corvan. A discussion about your qualifications, or exposure of your relationship with our head coach. The question carried implications that made both Gavril and Celiora stiffen. Dr. Tharwick intervened before either could respond. I think we should focus on the relevant factors, she said diplomatically. Mr. Droswin's coaching potential, his daughter's involvement in the program, and the facility's policies regarding background disclosure. Actually, said a new voice from the doorway, I think we should focus on what's happening outside. Monica Branville, Brookhaven's public relations director, entered the conference room carrying her laptop and wearing the expression of someone dealing with a developing crisis. We have a situation. She opened her laptop and turned the screen toward the board. On display was the website of Swimming World magazine, featuring a headline that made everyone in the room freeze. Olympic diving prospect hidden in plain sight. Former elite athlete coaches daughter while working maintenance at elite facility. The article was published 20 minutes ago, Monica said grimly. It includes photos of Lesen diving, quotes from anonymous parents questioning facility oversight, and speculation about whether Mr. Droswin has been providing unauthorized coaching to elite athletes. Christown's pen stopped tapping. How did they obtain this information? Someone leaked details from our internal investigation, Monica replied. The reporter contacted 3 board members for comment before publication. We have until noon to provide an official response. Through the conference room windows, Gavril could see a small crowd gathering in the facility's parking lot. Some carried cameras with telephoto lenses, others held notebooks and recording devices. The media attention he'd spent 20 years avoiding had found him anyway. Mr. Droswin, Thalrose said, her voice carrying new urgency. This changes our timeline considerably. We need immediate clarity about your intentions and our facility's liability. My intentions? Gavril asked. Are you planning to pursue coaching credentials? Corvan asked. Capitalize on your daughter's success? Return to competitive diving in any capacity? I want my daughter to have the opportunity to develop her talent in a supportive environment, Gavril said. Beyond that, I haven't made any plans. That's not sufficient, Christown said bluntly. We have reporters asking whether we're harboring a former athlete with a questionable history. We have parents threatening to withdraw their young people unless we provide assurances about program integrity. We need definitive answers about your role here. Celiora stood abruptly. May I speak privately with Mr. Droswin for 5 minutes? The board members exchanged glances. You have 3 minutes, Christown said in the hallway outside the conference room. Celiora and Gavril stood beneath photographs of Brookhaven's championship teams, their whispered conversation urgent and intense. They're going to force you to choose, Celiora said. Either accept a formal coaching position with full background disclosure and media scrutiny, or leave the facility entirely. I can't coach, Gavril said. You know what that would mean. Every competition, every training session, every young athlete I work with becomes part of a story about my past. And if you leave, Lee-Sen loses access to the best coaching she's ever had, and you lose the chance to work with the most naturally gifted diver either of us has seen. There's a third option, Celia said quietly, which is, we leave together. Start our own program. Take Lee-Sen, any other athletes whose families trust us more than they fear bad publicity. Gavril stared at her. You'd give up Brookhaven? Your position, your reputation, your coaching career here. I'd exchange them for the chance to coach with you again, she said. The chance to give young athletes what we never got to complete ourselves. Before Gavril could respond, Dr. Tharwick emerged from the conference room. They're ready for your decision, she said. And Mr. Droswin, you should know that 3 more news outlets have picked up the story. Whatever you choose, it needs to account for the fact that anonymity is no longer an option. As they walked back into the conference room, Gavril could see Lee-Sen through the windows, completely focused on her training despite the chaos developing around her. She executed a perfect reverse pike, her form flawless, her joy in the sport undimmed by the adult complications swirling overhead. Mr. Droswin, Kreisdown said as soon as they were seated, we need your decision. Will you accept a formal coaching position with this facility, under full disclosure of your background and media scrutiny? Or will you resign your current position and cease all involvement with our programs? The question hung in the air like a platform diver at the peak of their flight, suspended between past and future, between safety and possibility, between the life he'd built in the shadows and the life that might be possible in the light. Outside, reporters continued to gather, their cameras trained on the building where Olympic dreams were either born or buried. Inside, a room full of adults waited for one man's choice to determine the fate of a young girl's extraordinary potential. Gavril looked at Celia, who nodded almost imperceptibly. He looked at Dr. Tharwick, whose expression combined sympathy with professional necessity. He looked through the windows at his daughter, who dove with the fearless precision of someone who had never learned that dreams could be dangerous. And then he made his choice. Gavril stood slowly, his chair scraping against the polished floor with a sound that seemed to echo longer than physics should have allowed. Through the conference room windows he could see Lee-Sen climbing the ladder to the 3-meter platform, her movements confident and graceful despite the reporters gathering in the parking lot below. I need to ask you something first, he said, addressing the entire board but focusing on Kreisdown. What kind of facility do you want Brookhaven to be? The question clearly wasn't what anyone had expected. Thalrose frowned. I'm not sure I understand the relevance. Do you want to be a place where young athletes learn that talent is only valuable if it comes without complications? Gavril continued. A place where people's worst moments define them permanently. Or do you want to be somewhere that believes in growth, redemption, and the possibility that our failures can become the foundation for helping others succeed? Kreisdown's expression hardened. Mr. Droswin, we need a decision about your employment status, not a philosophical discussion. This is both, Gavril replied. Because whatever you decide about me, you're also deciding what message you send to every young athlete who trains. Hear about what happens when life gets complicated. Dr. Tharwick leaned forward. What are you proposing? Gavril walked to the window, placing his hand against the glass as he watched Lee-Sen prepare for her dive. I'm proposing that you hire me as an assistant diving coach, with full disclosure of my background and complete transparency about the circumstances that led me here. The room fell, silent except for the distant sound of young voices from the pool deck. You understand what that means? Asked Corvan. Media scrutiny, questions from parents, constant examination of your methods and motivations. I understand that hiding hasn't protected my daughter from any of those things, Gavril said, turning back to face the board. The story is already out. The reporters are already here. The choice isn't between exposure and privacy anymore. It's between shame and purpose. Ciliora spoke quietly. I support this proposal. Gavril has more technical knowledge and competitive experience than any coach we could hire. His understanding of high-level diving psychology is unmatched, and his dedication to athlete development is evident in his daughter's progress. His daughter who has been training for less than 2 months, Thalrose pointed out. His daughter who has made more technical progress in 6 weeks than most athletes make in 2 years. Ciliora countered. That doesn't happen by accident. It happens when someone with elite-level understanding provides subtle, consistent guidance. Kreestown opened the investigation file again. Mr. Droswin, if we were to consider this proposal, we would need complete transparency. No more hidden connections, no more undisclosed relationships, no more surprises that might compromise our program's integrity. You would have complete transparency, Gavril said, including the real reason you left competitive diving. Gavril felt his throat tighten. Including everything. Monica looked up from her laptop. The Swimming World article has been shared over 3,000 times. USA Today just picked it up. We're going to be fielding calls all afternoon, regardless of what we decide here. Regardless of what we decide here. What's the current media narrative? Dr. Tharwick asked. Mixed, Monica replied. Some outlets are focusing on the feel-good angle. Hidden talent revealed, second chances, father coaching daughter. Others are emphasizing the scandal angle, questionable background checks, facility oversight failures, potential safety concerns. How do we control that narrative? Kreestown asked. We don't, Monica said bluntly. But we can influence it by being proactive instead of reactive. Full disclosure, immediate press conference, demonstration of our commitment to both athlete safety and second chances. Corvan, who had been silent for several minutes, finally spoke. I competed during the era when Mr. Droswin's investigation occurred. The diving community was small then, and rumors traveled fast. I remember the whispers, the speculation, the way people chose sides without knowing facts. He paused, studying Gavril's face. I also remember thinking at the time that someone with his talent didn't just disappear without good reason. Either he was guilty and running, or he was innocent and destroyed. Which do you think it was? Thalrose asked. Based on what I've seen today, and knowing what I know about how our sport handles controversy, I think he was innocent and destroyed, Corvan said. The question is whether we want to be part of continuing that destruction, or part of enabling reconstruction. Through the windows, they could see Lysen beginning her approach. 3 steps, perfect timing, clean takeoff into a reverse 1.5 somersault. Her entry was textbook, vertical, controlled, barely disturbing the water's surface. She's remarkable, Dr. Tharwick observed. She's her father's daughter, Ciliora said, echoing her words from the previous evening. Gavril watched his daughter surface, saw her look toward the conference room windows, and wave with the unconscious confidence of someone who had never doubted that the adults in her life would make good decisions on her behalf. If you hire me, he said quietly, I can't promise there won't be difficult conversations with parents or challenging questions from reporters. I can't guarantee that my past won't create complications for this program. What can you guarantee? Kreestown asked. I can guarantee that every young athlete I work with will learn that their worth isn't determined by their worst moment, Gavril said. I can guarantee that they'll understand the difference between perfectionism and excellence, between winning and succeeding, between talent and character. And technically, I can help develop divers who compete at levels this program has never reached before, Gavril said with quiet confidence. Because I understand what it takes to be exceptional, and more importantly, I understand what it costs when that understanding comes too late. Ciliora stood as well. I'd like to add something to this proposal. If the board is willing to take a risk on Gavril, I'm willing to restructure my own contract. to include shared accountability for program outcomes. We coach together, we succeed or fail together. That's a significant commitment. Thalrose noted. It's the right commitment, Celiora replied. 20 years ago, we were separated by misunderstanding and fear. We've both spent the time since then learning how to be better than we were. This is our chance to prove that second chances can create something stronger than first opportunities. The board members conferred in whispers while Gavril and Celiora waited. Outside, more reporters had arrived, and facility security was working to keep them away from the training areas where young athletes continued their sessions. Finally, Christown spoke. Mr. Droswin, the board is prepared to offer you a provisional coaching position, contingent on several conditions. Gavril's heart began beating faster. What conditions? First, you will participate in a public press conference this afternoon, providing complete disclosure of your background and the circumstances of your hiring. Second, you will undergo formal coaching certification through US at diving within 6 months. Third, your performance will be evaluated monthly for the first year, with particular attention to parent feedback and athlete progress. And fourth, added Thalrose, you will work exclusively with Coach Vrenak's oversight for the first 6 months. No independent coaching decisions, no private training sessions, no actions that could be construed as circumventing proper authority. Gavril looked at Celiora, who nodded encouragingly. I accept those conditions. Then we have an agreement, Christown said, standing to shake Gavril's hand. Welcome to the Brookhaven coaching staff. Mr. Droswin, I hope this works out better for everyone than your last experience with competitive diving. As the board members filed out of the conference room, Gavril remained by the window, watching Lysen begin another dive. This time, when she looked toward the conference room, he raised his hand and gave her a thumbs up. Her smile was brilliant enough to power the entire facility. Ready for your first press conference as a coach? Celiora asked, joining him at the window. Ready to stop hiding, Gavril replied. Everything else we'll figure out as we go. Outside, reporters continued to gather, but they were no longer hunting a story about scandal and secrecy. They were covering a story about courage, second chances, and the possibility that our worst moments could become the foundation for our best work. In 2 hours, Gavril Droswin would face cameras and questions about choices made 20 years ago. But right now, he was simply watching his daughter dive with the kind of joy that reminded him why he'd fallen in love with the sport in the first place. The crucial decision had been made. Everything that came next was just the beginning. 6 weeks after the press conference that had transformed Gavril Droswin from maintenance worker to coaching sensation, the Brookhaven Aquatic Center buzzed with an energy that veteran staff had never experienced. The media attention that had initially felt threatening had evolved into something powerful and positive, drawing young athletes from across 3 states who wanted to train under the guidance of a coach who understood both excellence and resilience. Morning of the Regional Youth Championships found Gavril standing poolside in his official Brookhaven coaching polo, watching as 12 young divers prepared for competition. His coaching certification had arrived the previous week, making his position officially permanent. But more importantly, his athletes had developed the kind of confidence that came from working with someone who had navigated both triumph and failure at the highest levels. Coach Gavril called Marcus Horif, a 10-year-old who had joined the program specifically to work with the famous coach who used to be a janitor. The boy's mother had driven 4 hours from another state after reading about Gavril's story online. Should I try the reverse dive we've been practicing? What does your body tell you? Gavril asked, employing the teaching method that had become his signature, helping young athletes develop internal awareness rather than external dependence. Marcus closed his eyes briefly, visualizing the dive sequence they had rehearsed countless times. It tells me I'm ready. Then trust it, Gavril said simply. Across the pool deck, Celiora worked with the platform divers, but her eyes frequently found Gavril's. sharing the quiet satisfaction of coaching partners whose methods complemented perfectly. Their collaboration had exceeded everyone's expectations, producing athletes who competed with both technical precision and emotional intelligence. The transformation extended beyond just the elite program. Word had spread through the broader swimming community about the coach who had turned his greatest failure into his most powerful teaching tool. Gavril now led weekly sessions for young athletes struggling with performance anxiety, using his own experience with public scrutiny and professional disappointment to help them develop resilience. "Dad, I'm nervous," Lisanne admitted as she prepared for her first official competition. At 8 years old, she was the youngest competitor in her division, but her technical ability had earned her a spot on the team. "Good nervous or bad nervous?" Gavril asked, kneeling to her level with the patience that had made him beloved among his athletes. "Good. Nervous," she said after thinking about it. "Like my body wants to show everyone what we've been working on. Then let's show them." Lisanne's first dive was a front 1.5 somersault that she executed with the controlled precision of someone much older. Her entry was clean, her form textbook, and when she surfaced, the applause from the Brookhaven section was thunderous. But it was her second dive that truly demonstrated the magic of what Gavril and Celiora had built together. As Lisanne prepared for a reverse dive that pushed the boundaries of what 8-year-olds typically attempted, she caught sight of a younger diver from another team who was crying after a failed attempt. Without being asked, Lisanne walked over to the girl and whispered something that made her stop crying and nod seriously. When Lisanne returned to prepare for her own dive, Gavril asked what she had said. "I told her that Coach Gavril says the best divers aren't the ones who never mess up," Lisanne replied. "They're the ones who get back up and try again." The wisdom his daughter had internalized from watching his own journey from shame to purpose filled Gavril with pride deeper than any personal achievement had ever created. As the competition continued, parents from other teams approached Gavril with questions about his training philosophy, his techniques for developing young athletes, and his approach to helping competitors handle pressure. The conversations were respectful, curious, and entirely focused on his coaching abilities rather than his controversial past. By the end of the day, 3 Brookhaven divers had qualified for state championships, including Lisanne, who finished second in her age group, despite being the youngest competitor. But more importantly, every athlete on the team had competed with the kind of joy and confidence that suggested they understood diving as more than just a sport. They saw it as an opportunity to discover what they were capable of becoming. The drive home was quiet, filled with the satisfied exhaustion of a successful competition. Lisanne had fallen asleep in the back seat, her second-place ribbon still clutched in her small hand. "You did something remarkable today," Celiora said as they pulled into the Brookhaven parking lot. "We did something remarkable," Gavril corrected. This was always meant to be a partnership. As they carried sleeping athletes to their parents' cars and packed equipment for another day of training ahead, Gavril realized that his triumphant return hadn't been about proving his worth to critics or overcoming his past mistakes. It had been about discovering that his greatest gift wasn't his natural ability or technical knowledge. It was his capacity to help others believe in possibilities they hadn't known existed. 1 year later, the Brookhaven Aquatic Center had been transformed into something unprecedented in the world of competitive diving. What began as a regional training facility had evolved into a destination program that attracted young athletes not just for its technical excellence, but for its revolutionary approach to developing both champions and character. Gavril stood in his office, a space that had once seemed impossible to imagine, reviewing applications from families across the country who wanted their young divers to train under what the media had dubbed the Phoenix program. The name had emerged organically from the story of coaches who had risen from the ashes of their broken partnership to create something stronger than either had achieved alone. Through his window, he could see the new wing of the facility, funded by donations from parents and corporate sponsors who believed in second chances and transformative coaching. The expansion included specialized training areas for athletes with disabilities, a sports psychology center, and a museum dedicated to the stories of athletes who had overcome adversity to achieve greatness. "Dad, are you ready for the ceremony?" Lisanne asked, appearing in his doorway wearing her Team USA warm-up suit. At 9 years old, she had become the youngest diver ever selected for the junior national team. But more importantly, she had developed into a leader who helped newer athletes navigate the pressures of competitive diving. "Almost," Gavril said, straightening his tie. Today marked the official opening of the Gavril and Celiora Coaching Institute, a non-profit program that would train coaches to work with young athletes who had experienced trauma, setbacks, or challenges that traditional programs weren't equipped to handle. The ceremony was being held on the same pool deck where Gavril had once mopped floors in anonymity. Now that deck was filled with Olympic officials, fellow coaches, former athletes, and families whose lives had been touched by the program's unique philosophy. "Ladies and gentlemen," announced Dr. Tharwick, who had become one of the program's most vocal advocates, "it's my honor to introduce two individuals who have redefined what's possible when talent meets resilience, when partnership overcomes misunderstanding, and when the courage to be vulnerable becomes the foundation for extraordinary achievement." Celiora stepped to the podium first, her voice carrying clearly across the natatorium. "A year ago, we were two people carrying 20 years of hurt and misunderstanding. Today, we're partners in something that proves our worst moments don't have to define our future contributions." When Gavril joined her at the podium, the applause was sustained and heartfelt. He looked out at the crowd, seeing faces of young athletes he'd coached, parents who had trusted him with their most precious gifts, and colleagues who had supported his journey from maintenance worker to master. "Coach, I spent 20 years believing that my value was determined by my failures," he said. "This program exists to ensure that no young athlete ever has to learn that lesson. We're here to teach them that setbacks are setups for comebacks, that champions are made not just in moments of victory, but in moments when they choose to get back up." The crowd included representatives from USA Diving, who had officially recognized the program as a center of excellence for both athlete development and coaching education. More significantly, it included dozens of young athletes whose confidence and competitive success demonstrated that the program's methods worked. After the ceremony, as families mingled and young divers demonstrated their skills for visitors, Gavril found himself standing beside the diving well where everything had changed. Marcus Hallrath, now 11 and bound for national competitions, was teaching a 6-year-old newcomer the basics of proper entry technique. "He's doing exactly what you taught us," Celiora observed, joining Gavril beside the pool. "Passing on what he's learned, helping others believe in themselves. That's the real measure of success," Gavril replied. "Not what our athletes achieve, but what they become and how they help others become better too." Lisanne approached them, still wearing her Team US, a warm-up, but now with grass stains from playing with younger athletes during the outdoor reception. "Dad, some of the new families are asking if you'll do another one of your talks about handling pressure and mistakes. What do you think?" he asked his daughter, who had become his most trusted advisor on matters of coaching philosophy. "I think you should tell them about the time you thought your life was over because of one investigation, and how it turned out that wasn't an ending at all," she said, with the wisdom that continued to amaze him. "I think you should tell them that sometimes the best coaches are the ones who know what it feels like to lose everything and find it again." As the sun set over the Brookhaven Aquatic Center, Gavril gathered a group of parents and young athletes around the diving well for one of his informal talks about resilience, growth, and the difference between perfection and excellence. The setting was the same where he had once cleaned and hidden, but everything else had been transformed. "The most important thing I can teach your young people," he told the gathered families, "isn't how to execute perfect dives. It's how to understand that their worth isn't determined by their performance. Their mistakes don't define their character, and their greatest contributions often come from their willingness to help others navigate challenges they've overcome themselves. Looking around at the faces watching him, coaches, athletes, parents, and Ciliora, whose partnership had made all of this possible, Gavril realized that his new beginning wasn't just about returning to diving or even about coaching success. It was about discovering that some stories don't end with redemption. They begin with it, creating ripples that spread far beyond anything one person could achieve alone. In the diving well, young athletes continued practicing their approaches, their dreams as unlimited as the sky above the open pool. And watching them, Gavril Droswin knew that the best chapters of his story were still being written. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.